This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
Good afternoon, and dear listeners, this is Teachers Talk Radio. You're listening to the Sunday Twilight Show with Maud. It is 5:04 on Sunday, the 9th of July, 2023. You can join me using the chat function. We can discuss today's topic, which is decolonizing the curriculum, with our interviewee, Danielle.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Good afternoon, I should say late afternoon and early evening, fellow educators and dear listeners. This is my 44th radio show as your hostess, and I'm delighted to share this exciting experience in your company. But first, I have to introduce myself for any potential new listener. I am Maud, a French citizen of French and West African ancestry, and I have been living in the United Kingdom since 2008. I'm a professional educator working in a secondary state school in North London where I teach languages and humanities. I also have experience as a teacher in the charity sector. You can follow me on social media, on Twitter at MFL. All views are my own. Today, I would like to focus on a topic that is extremely important to me in my practice as a teacher and also in my personal life. I'm going to be joined later on by our interviewee, who is Danielle Baudet. She's a content writer and a writer who provides resources for French teachers who want to teach French in a cultural and linguistic way. So the podcast and discussion will be both on the topic of decolonizing the curriculum, because Danielle has been working on this for quite many years. This podcast is mostly relevant to parents who live in the United Kingdom, teachers who work in the United Kingdom, anyone who is interested in anti-racism campaigns, anyone who is a human rights activist, and the curious and savvy. So first, the term decolonizing needs a bit of explaining, so let's go back to what it means. Decolonizing the curriculum means three different things. First, it means asking ourselves to look at the world we live in, to look at the societies we live in, and to question all the shared assumptions that we have about our world and how it functions. Decolonizing the curriculum starts by decolonizing the gaze. It is questioning the impact that colonization, but also slavery and economic inequalities have on our shared history, on our global economy, and our cultural representations in the media and in the arts. Once we have that questioning and we have changed the way we look at things, there comes the second step. This is decolonizing what we do in schools and in education. It's mostly parents and teachers thinking about the implications that teaching a decolonized curriculum has on our diverse student body, where we have children from many different ethnicities with many different experiences of life. And what does it do in our pedagogy and in our achievement system? And the third step is about making people from ethnic minorities more prominent in the media and in the arts, and also in all fields of life, making public and historical figures who happen to be from ethnic minorities more seen, more heard, and making artists who are from these ethnic minorities represented. So it takes three steps. But obviously, the term decolonizing comes from the opposite of colonizing. And we all know that colonization started many centuries ago, as far back as the 15th century, for instance, when the island of Gran Canaria were invaded by the Spanish, and the local indigenous population was a victim of a genocide. Their language, their culture, the site they had inhabited and occupied since prehistoric times were robbed for these people. So colonization has happened over at least 6 centuries. Now, decolonizing was a slow process that happened much later. Let's say around the 1930s and 40s. Now, decolonizing our thoughts is a concept that was first mentioned in an essay written by Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who is a Kenyan writer. He wrote an essay in the 1980s, so almost 40 years ago, entitled Decolonizing the Mind, the Politics of Language in African Literature. So he comes from, obviously, a literary and literature background because he's a novelist and essayist, but he thought about language and he thought about politics in his essay. You can also read his reflection on his time in jail in Wrestling with the Devil, which was published after he spent a year in jail. It's a prison memoir. So Ngugi wa Thiong'o, a little bit over 50 years ago, decided while he was in jail for political reasons that he just questioned why he had been writing in English. He had been writing novels which were really acclaimed and respected in Kenyan literature, but it was always in English. And once he got in jail, because of his work as a writer, he decided to write in his own mother tongue, which is the Gikuyu language. And once he started, it was opening a breach. And then his whole reflection about decolonizing started to take shape. So he wanted to basically get rid of the legacies of the British colonial past, and he decided to also use his mother tongue, but also to question the Christianity he had been brought up in and his baptismal name. So if we look at an interview he made, he was explaining that when he was in prison, he was really angry because he had been in prison not by the British government, but by the new independent African government of Kenya. And he was very upset because he was not a threat to society, he was just a writer. But he started thinking about colonialism and the language. He was not issued paper and pen to write, so he had to steal the toilet paper, which was very coarse and hard, but actually very good for writing. So he ironically wrote his prison memoir on toilet paper. And he explained that for him, it was not renouncing English as a language, because he's obviously multilinguist and he's happy to use English and he's happy to teach in English and he's happy to read in English. But for him, learning to write in his own mother tongue was about being empowered. And he said, I quote, "If you know all the languages of the world, but you don't know your mother tongue, that is enslavement. But if you know your mother tongue and add all the languages of the world, that is empowerment." So his thinking was that by using Gikuyu language, his mother tongue, he was becoming a free man, even though he was locked up in a prison for his writing. He says, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, that languages and cultures should relate as a network of equals. So we shouldn't think that English is more important than any other languages and that Gikuyu is not an important language. For him, they're all equal and they should not be presented in a pyramidal hierarchical of unequal power relationship, which is still how it is most of the time. When we choose a language, we often think, I need to choose a language that is good for business, or I need to choose a language that allows me to speak with as many people as possible. Yes, that could be a motivation, but also promoting the culture and your personal heritage culture is also fundamental to yourself as a person. So he was also explaining, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, that even though the colonizer, and in that instance the British Empire, which had left Kenya by then, he said the colonizer was still having control over the culture because of neo-colonialism. And he said that even though Kenya was an independent country politically, its economy is still controlled by Western powers to this day, even in 2023. And this predominance of Western economy has an impact on the culture and the psyche of all the nations which are still independent but not freed from this colonialism. So when I started my journey in the decolonizing field, it was something I had always been aware, but I didn't know there was a name for it. It's only when I attended a lecture at Goldsmiths University in 2020 that the word decolonizing came up. And I realized that this fitted with my worldview. And my worldview had been developed over decades of living in the West, whereas I am of dual ancestry. And I realized as a student and then later on as a teacher that I had to teach a very narrow minded curriculum that was always putting on a pedestal the works of white male um, figures, middle class figures, and also Western figures. And it was done so often and so much that it appeared normalized. But when I started thinking about women history, and when I looked into all the female writers and all the people of colors who were not broadcast or published or promoted, I realized that it was a conscious decision, and it was actually very manipulative to pretend that there was no good art made by people of color or by women, and that only male white middle class figures were supposed to be in the curriculum. So it took me years to just realize this. And decolonizing the gaze was a very personal process. I couldn't name it, but once I had an introduction to that word, then everything fitted and came into place. And I started presenting, training, and attending conferences where I spoke about decolonizing my practice as a teacher, because that's what I can do, because that's what I'm trained for. And also, this is the only platform I have. My work in opening up the gaze and questioning the world we live in goes through pedagogy and teaching. But it could be done in a different way if I were a sculptor or a film director. So any medium can be used as long as the process is opening up consciousness to how biased our education and our worldview has been for many, many years. So, after the Second World War, the United Nations, via the UNESCO, so the Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization of the United Nations, started to question the concept of race because we had just been through two world wars, and a lot of the issues that we had to face in the world wars were about sovereignty and a racial construct. So the United Nations published a report in 1963 that insisted on the lack of scientific knowledge. Um, Race is not scientific, it's a myth. No one is not part of the human race, and there's actually only one human race. Whether have a skin of different shade is irrelevant. We are all just one. So dividing people according to their ethnicity and their skin tone or their hair type is completely unscientific, and it's been promoted by the United Nations ever since. But we still see how much racism pervades all our societies and how much it is institutionalized ever since. So the first step as trained and savvy citizen is to try to eradicate racism because it's unscientific and it's damaging. I quote a book written by Ineke van der Valk, Racism, a Threat to Global Peace. It's available online if you check the International Journal of Peace Studies. And Ineke says, I quote, ethnic minority groups are represented in public debate, in the press, in politics, in scientific literature, and in school books by opinion makers originating from the majority group. It is crucial for understanding the phenomenon of racism is the observation that racism not only refers to overt and violent forms of social domination and exclusion, but also to more indirect and subtle forms expressed in daily practices, including through discursive practices. So, what she's pinpointing at, Ineke van der Valk, in her essay about race, is that the way we present knowledge in the media and in education is biased. It's biased by a majority. And let's say that majority is not actually a majority in numbers, because if you look at the whole population in the world, being white is a minority by itself. There's more people of color than people who are white ethnically. And yet they are the ones who have built up a myth that their ethnicity was something that was higher than the others, and they still use a lot of their power economically or via the media to promote this ideology and to further inequalities. So, as a teacher, I've started to develop a way to teach which reflects a decolonized way of thinking, which questions assumptions, which always asks, why is the world the way it is? And what can we do to make it fairer, more just, more moral, and also with a lot of equity, not just equality? So I developed what I called activisions. And activisions are just a play on word on the two words activities and visions, because obviously I'm a teacher, so I need to do activities with my students. But also these activities are part of a vision. And this vision is opening up to opening the consciousness of the students so that they realize that the world we live in is biased and that we need to change our mindset. So these activisions start from September all the way to July. I'm taking August as a holiday month. In September, it goes with the celebration of Afro Hair Day on the 15th of September. In October, there is the UK Black History Month. In November, I'm celebrating famous French-speaking figures of ethnic minorities. In that instance, it was Josephine Baker. But you can choose any other Black or ethnic minority person who is talented in a particular field. In December, I offer lessons that offer a decolonized Christmas, where we question where Christmas comes from as a tradition and what it represents. In January, we talk about the three kings in the Nativity, because one of the kings was a Black man, Balthazar. He was king of Ethiopia. In February, it's the Mardi Gras celebrations, it's Shrove Tuesday, it's Pancake Day, but it's also how people have changed a very Catholic medieval tradition into a regional, local tradition that is way more inclusive. So I chose to talk, for instance, about Mardi Gras in New Orleans in the USA. In March, it's a celebration of the Black Lives Movement, because it's a movement that is promoting the protection of Black lives facing police brutality. In April, it's a celebration around Easter, and it's also Easter in different places in the Francosphere, not just in France, because I teach French, but also in all the countries that have people who speak French. It could be Senegal, it could be Lebanon, it could be Canada, it could be the territories that were formerly part of France, any other country that has French and some elements of French culture mixed with their own indigenous culture. In June, I celebrate other Black and ethnic minority figures, and then I try to organize school trips in reference to that to celebrate the end of the year with my students. And in July, I try to show that there is people who have been victims of politics, and I try to give my students an idea about this. And I use the figure of Patrice Lumumba, but not only. I also talked about Léopold Sédar Senghor, who used to be the French Secretary of State and then the first president of Senegal, of an independent Senegal. So it's a calendar that allows French teachers and any history teacher or someone who does PSHTE to represent different perspectives on the idea of decolonizing knowledge and education. Now, as we are mostly educators or parents, we do want to give as many facts to our students so that they can also practice their own critical mind and just make their own minds. So it is important to always address racism when we see it and to be very firm and strict that this is unacceptable. It is also very important to be inclusive and not just talk about our own experience. I don't just focus on female or women of color. I also focus on people from the LGBTQ community and also people from the Roma or travelers community, or people who have an Asian background or any other South American background. It's not just about my own personal history, it's the human history, and being human in all its representation, not just people who are living in urban cities in very modern housing. It could also be nomads, people who do not have that lifestyle, because their way of life is just as important as my way of life. And finally, as a teacher, we need to celebrate achievements of people who are from the majority in numbers, but the minority in representation. So people from ethnic minorities mostly. What does decolonizing the curriculum look? If you think about institutions and structures, well, I'm going to give you a little task. If you visit a school, always check which ethnicity is represented. Who is represented in the cleaning staff, in the pastoral staff, and then in the senior leadership teams? Too often, I see schools that promote themselves as being very inclusive and diverse, and yet I see people from ethnic minorities more in the cleaning staff than in SLT, in positions of more power. So I would really urge anyone who works in a school to check the employees and see if they reflect the diversity of the United Kingdom's population. If you only have white middle class people in positions of power, you do not have an inclusive school. So we need to model the behavior that we want in society. So if in your corporation you have a majority of people who are male in positions of power, you do not have an inclusive, decolonized company. It has to start from the top. So my advice is always check who's in position of power, remove discriminatory school policies, make sure everybody is represented. If you have something that is to promote people with disabilities, make sure that you also have something to promote people who have religions. For instance, do you have a prayer room in your school? Do you have accessible lifts for people with disabilities? Do you have a school with a lot of noise? Because that is detrimental to people who are neurodivergent. So to make your space safe and inclusive, you're going to have to make a lot of changes in your school, and they have to be made with equity in mind. It is time for the news. And then we will welcome our interviewee, Danielle. So let's listen to the news.
It's time for a fresh start to language learning. Pearson EdXL's new student-centred French, German and Spanish 2024 GCSEs cater to the needs of all learners, regardless of their background, ability or reason for studying. Rooted in learned language knowledge, their assessments are transparent and accessible, allowing all students to showcase their language skills. Through inclusive and relatable content, the new Pearson EdXL MFL GCSEs build a shared cultural capital that helps students develop an understanding of and appreciation for the wider world. Find out more at go.pearson.com/MFL GCSE 24.
This programme has been brought to you by the Happy Confident Company. Our clinically approved, ready-to-go wellbeing and mental health programme will help your pupils thrive. In only 10 minutes a day, you'll be able to deliver social and emotional learning and wellbeing tools throughout your school. To find out more, visit us at www.happyconfident.com.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
BBC News reports that the school run by Ruth Perry, who took her own life after a critical Ofsted, has been rated good after a new inspection. Ms Perry died in January after receiving news her school was being downgraded from outstanding to inadequate. Ms Perry's death prompted an outpouring of anger about the inspection system, although Ofsted defended its grading process and said one-word gradings would not be scrapped. The latest report comments on the work done by the school to address previous weaknesses. The new report raises again the question of high-stakes inspections. MPs are to hold an inquiry in the autumn and will look at how the system is working. Ms Perry's sister, Professor Julia Waters, said in a statement, "The reversal of the previous judgment in a matter of months illustrates why schools should be given the time to correct weaknesses before the final report is published, and that the latest judgment proves what all of those who knew Ruth and the school have known all along." Last month, Ofsted announced some changes which allow schools that were given an inadequate rating over safeguarding to be re-inspected within 3 months, giving them a chance to be regraded if they have addressed concerns. Teachers' pay has been in the news again following 2 further days of strike action from teachers in England. The Daily Mirror reports that Education Secretary Gillian Keegan is continuing to be under pressure to publish pay proposals or risk strikes dragging on even longer. All the major teaching unions in England are conducting fresh ballots after rejecting a £1,000 one-off payment for 2023 and an average 4.5% pay rise for next year. The government referred the decision on pay to the pay review body, who has reportedly recommended a 6.5% pay rise, but the DfE continues to refuse to publish the advice. The Guardian reports on Labour's plans for education should they win the next general election. The article itself focused on plans for early years, which could see more graduate teachers working in nurseries and more nursery places in primary school settings. Shadow Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson said she wanted to put early years on an equal footing with schools to give children the best start in life. The TES gave further comment on Labour's plans as the party set out how it plans to boost teacher retention and improve standards. The plan includes giving early career teachers a one-off payment of £2,400 for staying in the profession and sending regional improvement teams to help schools. New teachers will be required to have QTS, and they will also improve recruitment by cutting costs. The party, currently in opposition, has not made any comment on teacher pay. Finally, the BBC reports on what it describes as a crisis in waiting for children in care. In March, the government extended a ban on unregulated homes to children in care aged 16 and 17. This followed a BBC investigation which found some had been forced to live in caravans and barges, and some had experienced abuse. The crackdown begins in October, when Ofsted will begin inspections, and all unregulated care settings will become illegal. However, some local authorities fear they will have to continue the use of unregulated accommodation, usually in houses and flats in residential areas, because they will have no alternative. Regulated placements are suffering chronic staff shortages, and a squeeze on places at the same time as a rise on numbers of children coming into care is causing continued issues. A D&V spokesperson said it was the responsibility of local authorities to provide safe placements, but that it was investing £142 million over the next 3 years to ensure the transition to Ofsted registration is successful. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
This is 2 Minute Tech with Steve Woods, your tech briefing on Teachers Talk Radio.
Hello, this week I'm going to support a question everyone will see at the start of next year. It goes something like this. Hi EduTwitter, can you reply with where you are so I can show my class how far a post on the internet can reach? With a bit of free tech, you can make this much more visual. I'm going to use Google Maps because it's free and most likely you'll have used Google Maps at some point in the past. So, when you have all your responses, sign into Google, go to Maps and click on the menu next to the search box. That's the 3 lines that look like a burger. From the menu, select My Places. You'll now have 4 options: Lists, Labelled, Visited, and Maps. Click on Maps and at the bottom select Create Map. Now you can give the map a title so you can find it next year for comparison and add all the places from your Twitter replies. Simply type the name of the place. When it appears with a blue point marker, you can click the plus sign to add it to the map and then select a colour to help it stand out. When you've finished, all the places will be saved and you can access the map by following the first few steps: Menu, My Places, Maps. There are loads of other great tools to use also. Measure the distance from your school to those places, hit preview and go into the view only mode. Here you can select a place and you're treated to a short bio and an image of the area. So next time you're looking to bring a lesson to life, why not try using maps to help pupils see where places are in the world? Do you have any top tips for mapping? Why not get in touch and tell us what you want to know about tech? I'm Steve Woods and that was 2 Minute Tech.
2 Minute Tech with Steve Woods, your tech briefing on Teachers Talk Radio.
So let's meet up with Danielle, who, as I said, is content writer or writer who's been working on decolonizing, amongst other things. So thank you very much, Danielle, for joining us today. You are very, very active in decolonizing the curriculum movement. And I wanted to have your view. I wanted to ask you questions about it because I think it's something that needs to be broadcast a lot. So first, Danielle, tell us what you do, what's your background, how come you came into education in the UK? Tell us more about yourself.
Right. Well, thank you for inviting me to speak in the first place, Maud. Well, I've been in the UK for 40 years, and for those 40 years, I've been involved in education. I came in with the dinosaurs in 1982 as a foreign language assistant, and I was working in 2 schools. And I stayed, like 50% of foreign language assistants did. I then worked in colleges of further education and adult institutes. So that's in the 80s and the 90s. I set up the Department of Languages, the French Department of the Working Men's College in 1987, because they didn't have French at the time. So I taught beginners and O-level in those days because it was, and also before GCSE, and it was also before the national curriculum. So it's very, yes, it was a long time ago. I stopped teaching in adult education because I had children, and teaching in the evening in central London was a little bit tricky for me. But in 1987, I started putting my second cap on, which is the educational publishing, which I've been doing ever since. And I started writing magazines for a publisher called Mary Glasgow Publications. They had 4 magazines, and they're still going, but unfortunately not in the UK.
Oh, aren't because I still know some teachers who are receiving the
yes, that's it. That will be the end this year. So it's only in the US and Canada, I think, which is a terrible shame because they are lovely publications. And that led to other things, you know, from the magazines. I was asked to then write and edit other French material, like course books, and it just snowballed. I wrote the BBC course book for adult beginners called French Experience. Again, that was in the mid-90s. I wrote plays and fiction, non-fiction readers, apps, digital resources. But I think the most of my work was on course books. I did quite a lot of course books for Oxford University Press from primary to secondary with Equipe. And I still meet a lot of people that at conferences that remember Equipe and Equipe Nouvelle very well, either as students or as teachers. I was very proud of that book, actually, and it won an award in 2000, so I was happy with that. And also A-level with Elan. And that's when I really started thinking that actually culture had to be put in teaching resources because it wasn't done very well. So I did, and I published France Live with Oxford University Press, which was a little book about culture in France. It was in English, but it was mostly to give cultural background to the learning of the language. And now I'm mostly published for international markets, so for the International Baccalaureate and the IGCSE. And also, I've gone to the enemy as I'm now publishing for Cambridge University Press.
Ooh, on the other side.
Yes, the other side, where I published things for, as I said, the International Baccalaureate course called Panorama Francophone. Very, very well. We've tried to reflect the diversity of the French-speaking world in that book, which is easier to do actually in the IB program, which is international by nature, and an IGCSE book. And I now publish for another international publisher called LMI.
Right. So more than 30 years producing resources that have shaped a generation of French learners, if I understand you
basically.
Correct.
And I know that I hear a lot, let's ditch the textbook. But I think in those days, textbooks were perhaps the most easily available resource.
Definitely.
We're talking pre-internet for some of them.
Yes, of course, 30 years ago, for sure, we didn't have computer access and there was no other ways to get the resources you needed. You say that people are saying ditch the textbooks, but I hear a lot of teachers who are actually complaining that their schools don't want to purchase books anymore because they say books that get damaged quickly and that it costs a lot of money and it's a lot of storage. But then the teachers say that they have to print a lot, which is counterproductive if you want to save money, and also thinking of, we cut trees to make paper. So is that an environmentally friendly option? And I think there's still teachers who miss the good old days of using textbooks.
Yes, I mean, there are criteria to determine whether a textbook is a good textbook or not. But I think that's another discussion.
Yes, no, that's completely different. And it's also a matter of taste.
Yes.
And criteria that were not chosen by the teachers, but by the exam boards and the exam contents.
I mean, that was a big issue, actually, when I left the UK-based market. It's because of the endorsement by the exam board. Then that changed a lot of what we were able to do. I mean, there are lots of constraint on the author that not many people actually realize unless you start writing yourself. And there are things that are imposed and things that are not allowed.
It's a very rigid system.
Yes. And working as a consultant, I can also have a little say in what other people produce, which is great. As I've been working as a consultant for decolonization on some of the resources. So I can sort of see what is being done, but and I'm not always very happy with what is being done, but there, as I said, there are constraints. So it's easy to criticize, but when you see it from the inside, it's quite a different story.
I'm sure it's not an easy task. Now, I just wanted to... So we know you have a lot of experience. You've been producing resources. You've been thinking for more than 30 years on how to introduce French culture and French language in all its complexity and beauty to a new public, the students who are learning French at school. But you have also started thinking about diversity and about, as we say, decolonization. So could you pinpoint when you actually started thinking about this in your profession?
It's difficult to say, actually, because it's a bit like Molière's bourgeois gentilhomme. You know, I think I was decolonizing without knowing I was doing it. Because if I go back to where when my sensibility about that area started, actually, it goes a long way, and it was actually rooted in many ways in my personal life and my childhood. And nothing in my life actually made it obvious for me to become that sensitive to these issues, because I was white, middle class, from a very small place in Brittany, nothing except, and when you say pinpointed, it's not really pinpointing it, but it's something that, when you ask the question, is sort of automatically jumped to my mind, and it has an impact on what I do, actually, is because my father went to Algeria as a conscript during the Algerian War. Mm-hmm. He was sent there for 2 years, not wanting to go, obviously, but, had to go. He didn't have a choice. He didn't have a choice. It was that or prison. And he went to a small place called Bir El Ater near Tébessa in Algeria. It was along the Ligne Maurice, which was like the defense line with the Tunisian border. And he brought back some photos. And I've grown up with those photos. They were fascinating for me. That insight into a different world. He was, so this was a desert. This was the Tuareg, as we call them in French, mm-hmm. The Amazigh nomads in the late 50s, because we're talking 59. Yes. So it was like, wow, a different world from mm-hmm. my tiny place in France. And those photos, I still have them because they are very, very precious to me. It's also the horror stories that he told, not from his own experience, because he was actually quite, safe where he was, but his mates and came back with horror stories from the war. And I was also shocked. And I'm talking before I was 10, because there were things around my area that I was already shocked by. And one of them was how the Harkis, so the Algerians that were fighting for the French in the war, were treated when they came to France, because they couldn't stay in Algeria because of this, it was too dangerous. And they were they were housed in appalling conditions in a place not far from where I lived. And that made me realize various things, really. That, first of all, why did my father have to go there? Why was France there? Why was it French? I didn't know anything about, capitalism and human greed in those days, And I also knew, because of my father's experience, I also knew a bit more than my peers. And I realized that nobody cared about that war, which was not a war.
It was not called a war for
It was
decades.
not called a war. Le maintien de la paix, sort of keeping the peace.
The peace.
And that sort of made me aware very early on of double standards. That, they were deux poids, deux mesures. Yeah. Typical double standards for the French and the so-called French Algerian that were not treated like the others. And another thing that shocked me was my father's sense of guilt. And that stayed with me too. He loved the country, Algeria. He loved the people. He found them really, really proud and dignified. And, although they were in that sort of position of, being at war with.
Yeah.
But he never dared going back because he was feeling guilty. And that stayed with him, and that stayed with me. And I noticed growing up that there was nothing. I learned nothing about that at school.
Oh, it was mentioned much later in the 90s in some history book. I think it was one page in a history book.
Yeah. I learned nothing about it, and I was shocked. From then, secondary school, nobody's telling my dad's story. It was actually, hidden, from us. And then gradually I went to Paris and realized more. I had a boyfriend who was Greek and very Mediterranean looking, so constantly stopped. I lived in the République, which is the biggest tube station in Paris, and lots of police. And he was constantly stopped, but I wasn't. I also had friends that were North African because I went to Université de Paris 13, which was in the suburb, in the 9-3, yes.
Famous urban area.
and was friends with North African guys there. And they'd lived a life that I had not dreamt of in my bubble. Yes. That I had a comfortable flat in Paris. They were sharing a room, and not just sharing a room, they were sharing a bed. Because they couldn't afford anything else. So when one guy was, doing night shift, the other one would sleep, and so on. And that sort of made me aware of a lot of things. And in my studies, I came across a book which I wanted to work on the translation. I did a master's in literary translation in England. And I came across a passage to India, which was of interest to me because my partner is Indian, and I was fascinated by anything Indian. And I started reading the translation. And when I realized that actually it needed decolonizing. I didn't call it that at the time, but I thought that the language used was in the translation was completely inappropriate and inadequate and actually quite racist. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to retranslate it, and because the novel itself is like a denunciation of colonial outrages and the racial traumas of the Raj, and the translation was not doing that at all. So all that sort of shaped really from then on, and then having an Indian partner living in Broadwater Farm Estate in Tottenham soon after the riots of 85 opened my eyes as well to what it was like to be racialized, you say, because obviously none of that affects me personally.
Well, it does now, because you're the partner of someone who is not white. So
yeah,
you had to live through his experiences, but you did experience it.
But I don't. If I go out in the world, I don't experience what he's experienced.
Of course.
And
do you have children with your Indian partner?
Yes.
So
yes.
As a mother, you might also have had to deal with, racism in the playground, and having to deal with the impact in your own children that might have happened.
I didn't actually, because my children are awfully white.
So you did.
And as my son put it, when we had the scare of having perhaps Le Pen as our president,
2001.
Yeah. My son was, he wasn't 10 then. He sort of was worried about it because we talked about it. And he said, is my dad not going to be able to go to France? And I was saying, well, I don't know. That's the thing. It can lead to extreme situations with this sort of politics. And he said, what about me? Because my color is inside my skin.
Oh, that's a beautiful image.
Because he's white and was blonde, but he felt Indian and he felt half Indian. And he said, what about me? Where ma couleur est à l'intérieur de ma peau.
It's a beautiful image. I love how children come out with the most poetic things, completely naturally.
Yeah.
And a poet would have to slave for years on the perfect sentence, and the child just comes out with it.
Yeah.
It's magic. I have the same situation. I have two children, one who is white, blue-eyed, and one who is mixed race. And I had to, my son was the victim of some racist slur in his international London school. He was called the N-word a few times. And with my daughter, it's obviously never happened because she's white of appearance. And but I still felt there was an occasion when I was in a shop with her, and she was really little, and she looked like a mini Shirley Temples with blonde curls. And I was next to her, and as I'm a mixed race woman, people assumed the child was alone. So they were like, oh, there's a child on her own. And I had to say, oh no, she's with me. And they looked at me and they assumed automatically that I was the nanny.
Yes.
Of course. So it just shows when you're a mother and your child is of a different color, there's some weird situations happening.
Yes.
And then as soon as one obviously looks non-white, there's issues about racism starting from a very young age. So your child never experienced it, but he felt maybe that otherness that my son feels, because obviously his otherness shows through his skin shade. So it's really interesting. But I have to go back to what you said. I didn't know we were going so far back to the Algerian war with France in the process of decolonizing, because it was still a colony. So I love how your father introduced the idea of we shouldn't be there, or we do not have any reason to be there, and what we do there is wrong morally. And you felt it accurately
very accurately, yeah.
And it just shows that children have a very strong moral sense, and you were evidence of that. You felt that what the state was doing was morally wrong, and that's spurred you onto that journey of just, making things right. So
yes, and being shocked by things as well, being shocked and wanting to do something about it. I'm not really an activist in the sense that I don't go down on on the street, and I just don't, I work in the dark sort of thing. I want to nibble at things so that I can do my bit. And that really shocked me when you were asking what started me in my work with the decolonization. It was obviously what I said about my childhood, but I think it was the trigger that I thought, no, this is not going to happen. Is when I was told at one of the publishers that I was working for, where the publications were going to the States, the United States, that I could not have black faces on the cover. I could not have disabled children on the cover, and because that would put off the readers in that part of the States where the consultant was from. That made me acutely aware of the need for representation, because that was excluding anything that was not remotely what they wanted to see, which was white, middle class, etc.
It just shows how they don't understand how the publishing works, because why would you reduce your readership to such a small? I mean, it's still a minority in numbers of white middle class people. There's a big world out there. Why would you reduce it so much? It shows that it's more than blindfold, really, on the part of that person. So when did this happen? What kind of time was it? Time frame?
1987.
1987. Okay.
So things have changed.
Yes,
things have changed.
Thank God for that. I just noticed when I was in France over the spring term that on TV now there's presenters who are people of colors, and it was rare in the late 90s and early noughties, and now a lot of them are people from...
yes, we had Audrey Pulvar, and that was it.
That was it. Yeah, and she's from La Réunion, I think.
And a long time after, I can't remember the name of the black journalist that was on the BBC, but that's one of the things when I first came to England, I thought, wow, a blackface on the main news, not something about overseas, or it was mainstream.
Yeah, and now we see people from the South.
So it is, it is moving. It is moving, but I remember other things that really shocked me, and that were maybe more insidious than just not having a black face on the cover. I remember, for instance, some publishers' reluctance to mention, Afro hair or, anything to do with skin coloring or whatever, because that would be offensive, that could be misconstrued. I mean, basically, we were walking on eggs about that.
Yes, and I still hear that when I talk about decolonizing with educators. They are telling me I'm afraid of saying something wrong.
Yes.
And I think it stems from the severe backlash people can get sometimes when they say something that might seem offensive on social media. I do always tell them that we should accept that people make mistakes, and they should just be able to say, oh, I apologize if that was offensive. I didn't mean to hurt people's feelings. But we shouldn't use it as a stick and beat people with, because it's not helping anyone, really.
Yeah.
If people are scared of mentioning a skin color, I will always remember there was a new personal instructor at the gym, and someone asked, oh, what does she look like? Because they wanted to know what she looked like. And people were like, oh, well, she's mid-height, short hair, and she's wearing a pink t-shirt. And no one said she's black. And to me, it was ridiculous, because that would have been the first thing I said, because there was not that many female black personal instructor in that gym. And if you want to describe someone and recognize that person in a crowd, you would start by, okay, so she's black and she's got short hair and mid-height. but no one said her skin color. And because it was mostly white people, and they felt scared of saying she's black. And I was like, this is going too far because this is ridiculous. You know, it's like avoiding the elephant in the room. Start with what's the most distinctive trait. Obviously, if we were in a Nigerian gym, we wouldn't say she's black because everybody would be black. And so it wouldn't be an appropriate way of describing. But here in London, it felt very awkward. So I don't think this is the best way to decolonize, trying to avoid saying the obvious.
I think it's still happening, though. I think it's still happening.
Very much so.
I suggested actually that, you know, how in languages you sort of have description, you know, as you said, the hair, the eyes, and there are still sort of reluctance to say that the skin is black or dark or whatever, as part of a physical description. And to my mind, it's, you know, it's the same as being blonde or having your eyes blue or whatever. Yes. But unless that's normalized, it's always going to be a problem.
Yeah, and it just shows how important the work is. When I teach my students how to describe themselves in French or in Spanish, I give them words to say that their skin is olive complexion or brown or black. And whenever they say it, they kind of giggle because they feel awkward. And most of my students happen to be black or Asian. The minority is the white British in my school. And I'm always telling them, look at my skin. My skin is kind of brown or light brown. And I just say as if it was absolutely normal, because it is normal. I mean, it's the color of my skin.
Yeah, exactly. But that's not happening yet. Yeah.
They still feel that awkwardness. And I really want this to change. I want people to be able to describe themselves and say, oh, well, I've got afro, frizzy or curly, or I've got straight hair, or, you know, it's just a normal body attribute, physical attributes. Yeah.
It's time for a fresh start to language learning. Pearson EdXL's new student-centred French, German and Spanish 2024 GCSEs cater to the needs of all learners, regardless of their background, ability or reason for studying. Rooted in learned language knowledge, their assessments are transparent and accessible, allowing all students to showcase their language skills. Through inclusive and relatable content, the new Pearson EdXL MFL GCSEs build a shared cultural capital that helps students develop an understanding of and appreciation for the wider world. Find out more at go.pearson.com/MFL GCSE 24.
This programme has been brought to you by the Happy Confident Company. Our clinically approved, ready-to-go wellbeing and mental health programme will help your pupils thrive. In only 10 minutes a day, you'll be able to deliver social and emotional learning and wellbeing tools throughout your school. To find out more, visit us at www.happyconfident.com.
So you had that very strong moral conscience that made you question the status quo. So you obviously also had friends from many different ethnicity, and then your partner is from the South Asian continent. So you experienced by proximity the racism they went through on a daily basis. So what made you decide that you wanted to be proactive in the fight against racism in your job? You said 1987 when someone mentioned it in America. Was it the trigger, and then you started thinking every day I need to?
That was the trigger to me thinking you need representation in the resources, because that was the beginning of my career as a writer. So I hadn't had that experience of writing yet, but. Yeah, it was one of the first. It was a magazine. It was one of the first magazines that I did, and to be told that, it was like a slap on the face to me, and that was the trigger. And there were loads of little things after that, as I said, you know, not being able to mention skin color or whatever, or being told. I remember writing a short story about a child coming from Africa with his parents, so immigrating to France from Africa, and saying that he was missing things from his country.
Mm-hmm.
That was censored by the editor because that, and and him not being happy, not necessarily, because of difficulties, the looks he was getting and things. So it was a very short story, and in a textbook. And I was told, nope, you can't have that because that's negative. That's a negative vision of France. France is a terre d'accueil, land of refuge. Yes. And therefore, you should be seen to be happy in France. And I thought, what? But that story never got published. And
what a shame.
That's what I was saying. That was more insidious in some ways than being told no blackface, because that was representative of something quite, that France is this sort of
Perfect
example of égalité, fraternité, and so on, and there was no questioning it.
No, because it's a myth, and they were propagating the myth. And we know now, because we've watched the news over the last week, we know that this is not the truth. People live in France and they're very unhappy at the conditions they're in. And also, I just think it's so, black and white, excuse my pun, to think that if you go to France, everything's going to be rosy and happy. And that if you leave a country, everything in that country was bad or not good enough. It's not the truth. And this is also something I've always felt. It's that there's a very good aspect of culture and life in the countries we come from, when we come from the third world countries or low-income countries. And the West might benefit from using some of these aspects. It's not just all the other countries who need to follow what the Westerners are doing. Sometimes the Westerners would benefit from following what other countries are doing. And by not publishing that story you prepared and you wrote, they are still presenting that idea that the West is the universal perspective that everybody has to follow. And this is deeply wrong, because we know where it leads. When we live as a Westerner, we degrade our environment, we pollute it, we destroy a lot of our resources. And also, are we happier? I'm not sure. I'm not sure we are. When you see the youth, when you see the high level of mental health crisis in education, and so many children who are self-harming, depressed, I think in the West we do a lot of things wrong that we need to deal with, but by pretending everything is perfect, we are not acting on the issues we're facing.
And I think in France we are particularly good at thinking we're perfect.
There's a bit of arrogance in the French culture. We always think that we have so much to teach others, but it goes only one way, doesn't it? So we're just gonna have a little break now. And we are gonna go back to talking to Danielle for the second part of the interview. So, Danielle, we were talking about how you started working by promoting people who look different and writing stories about people who come from low-income countries and their experiences when they come to the West. So what is your main motivation nowadays when you think about writing resources? What do you have in mind? What's your perspective?
I think now well, things, as we were saying, things have moved on. So through the resources, we can open windows for the kids to discover a new world, like I did when I was a kid with the Algerian photos. But I think we're on the cusp of something, going from just representation to actual decolonization, if for lack of I don't know, it's a harsh term. It's quite hard to use, but for instance, I've always made a point that I wanted to feature francophonie in my resources, and I did. And there are examples of life which are always researched, so it's very time consuming, but it's always researched and accurate. Of daily life in North Africa or West Africa, etc. But that was still seen until not so long ago as tokenistic and unessential. So teachers were not valuing that very much, and we had comments back saying, "Oh, I didn't do that page because it was not about France." So I tried to make it more integral to the actual content of the resource, so that you couldn't skip it. Which we could do with my co-authors in the Panorama Francophone, because that was all about French-speaking countries. So all we couldn't just be Eurocentric on that, because the students are from all over the world. But I think now we can start exploring the underpinnings of francophonie. And I myself have moved away from using the word francophonie as much as I can, because to my mind, it has quite a lot of connotations, which I don't really like. And so, for instance, with my colleague, Susie Buell, we're trying to work on providing teachers with materials that will help them explore what I want to call the francosphere. And I know it's used in other places, because I think francophonie is very much what the French state is imposing. And it's also exclusive of other identities and languages. Whereas to say that Senegal is francophone is completely wrong. It's Wolophone, and a part of the community, of the population, speaks French. So it's a wrong term. And I think francosphere is more inclusive. I mean, it's the sphere, it's the globe, it's, and French is one of the languages spoken in those countries belonging to the francosphere. And to me, that's the words actually matter.
Oh, very much so. We teach languages, so it's all about the words and the etymology. Francosphere is also the idea that it's one way of seeing the world, but there's many other ways.
Exactly. And as I teach online, and I have as a background an upside down map, and the kids ask me, why did you put your map upside down? And I said, it's not upside down, because today I'm in New Caledonia, and that's in New Caledonia. This is, how you see the world. And why are you in New Caledonia? And I start explaining. So, it doesn't need a lot to start a discussion on those issues. And I think that's what resources can help teachers do, is starting a dialogue on those issues.
Yes, I mean, it blew my mind the first time I saw a map of the world, but with Russia in its center, because I did a year of Russian language a long time ago. And I had never realized that we always put France.
Yeah, of course. Europe, yeah.
And then when I saw that map, I was like, oh my God, this just shows how we manipulate learning in a way that we don't even realize. We don't realize we put ourselves always at the center as if we mattered so much. We don't. We matter in the sense that we are all together on this planet. But yeah, it's so important to change the maps we use. You're right. It's something that I need to practice even more with my students. And it's a good way of starting a lesson because they'll have lots of comments to make. So you have lots of motivations to bring the idea of change, the Francosphere, seeing French as a medium and not as something that overrules everything else. But what is your vision of education? What are you aiming for, let's say, in the next 5 years or in the next 10 years? What would be, for you, the way to educate the children who are going to be born in the next couple of years?
How many words am I allowed? Well, I mean, my partner is a teacher, a retired teacher in inner London, and his view, and I quote him, is that education is a basic human right, like food and shelter for all, and to deny it is a crime against humanity. And that's my vision of education too. My father was a teacher, and that was very much his view as well. So I've been, bathing in that from forever. I mean, in terms of, the decolonizing agenda, I think the school curriculum should educate to eradicate social concepts like racism. How we do that is tricky, but I think as has been shown in France very recently, it's very difficult to move on, and unless education is there to do that, it's not going to happen.
It's the first step to anything. It always goes through education, and you can't really.
And
yes, I'm listening.
And what I find difficult, so I'm very tentative in this decolonizing movement. I have no answer. I only have questions. I have certain ways of thinking, of doing things that I think could help. Not saying that they are right or whatever, but I feel that there are people thinking about this. There is a lot of resources on actually what it is to decolonize, how to go about it, how to recognize systemic or institutionalized racism. But then it stays very much up there in the sphere of academia. And there is a step missing between that and then putting it in baby talk for our little ones.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I'm trying to do, basically. I'm trying to educate myself so I attend millions of webinars and I go to festivals of social justice in Westminster University recently. I try and do as much as that as possible. It's very, very abstract. And what I feel my job is to make that concrete and manageable and usable for teachers that are already their agenda is already very full. So to actually expect them to take that aspect and add it to the pot we need to help for that, I think.
Yes,
and the resources that are used, I think can help with that.
It's you talk about baby talk, but it's also baby steps. It's not a change. I mean, it's been going on for decolonizing politically. It's been happening in the 60s. We still have a lot of work to do. There's still countries that are colonized. I was talking to my partner who happens to be Danish, and Denmark colonized Greenland many years ago, and Greenland still depends on Denmark, which makes, if you count Denmark's territory, it's a tiny little country, but as they have Greenland under their control, then it becomes a very big player on the world scene. So we still have countries that have been colonized and they're not independent yet. So it's still not finished, that political process. But now we're still working on the cultural process. And as you said, we started decolonizing our minds ourselves in our own private journey. You started, I guess your dad started it somehow, and then you became more aware of it in the 80s. And I'm working on it now since I've discovered the term decolonizing when I was at university. But we do, it's just a start. But the aim is definitely to eradicate racism. We don't want it. I don't want it for my grandchildren. I know it's not realistic to assume that my children won't have to experience it anymore, but I would love for my grandchildren not to have to deal with that. And I think when you live in London, you're lucky because it is an international city and people are from all walks of life and it works. It's a peaceful place. I mean, we've had riots, 2010 riots, due to police brutality, just the same situation as in France. But it seems like in London, if you are from North Africa or if you are from a former colony, you can get a job and you can get by life if you want to. There's still too many countries where it's harder, for instance, France. So our vision of education is definitely to eradicate that racism. And I think your job and what you do with Susie is really, really important. So could you tell us more about your project with Susie? What is it exactly that you do when you meet up with Susie? What are you two preparing?
It's happening very slowly because life has got in the way for both of us. But basically, the aim of the game is to, for me anyway, is to do the research, see how what there is out there that can be used, and because it's very hard for teachers to do the research that is necessary to find out about life outside of France in French-speaking areas. You probably can do that very easily online now, but you still get an authentic piece of text or a video or whatever, which is not necessarily accessible to the language learners. So therefore, the teacher would then have to make that accessible. Then you need to exploit that somehow. So, through various activities. So you need to write those activities. That is a long job. And that's what we are trying to do. We're trying to do that research, make the input accessible and develop some sort of exploitation. And that can be done maybe, as a starter. I know Susie has written some easy starters, easily usable starters. And maybe you can, I don't know, we maybe have like a country every month you visit a different country, and there would be materials for you to use. So that's the idea.
It's a brilliant idea. And I have to say that Susie has been traveling in the Francosphere.
Yes.
In Senegal mostly as well. And she took lots of pictures with, it's half linguistics, half cultural. So it's great resources for French teachers. You did say that there was a lot of constraints on from the exam board and from the publishers that makes your job difficult as a content writer for teachers. So if you had a magic wand, what would you do to make your job easier so that you could reach out to more teachers and provide better resources in order to decolonize the curriculum?
Oh, if I had a magic wand, you know what I'd do?
Tell me.
I'd get rid of exams.
Oof. Wow,
I'd
that's
get rid of
controversial,
exams.
Danielle.
this has been the bane of my life when, as a course book writer, can't do that because it's not in the exams.
Yes.
So unless we assess what we value, and not value what we assess, culture is not going to happen unless it's assessed. So how do you assess cultural knowledge? I'm not too sure, but there might be a way with a magic wand. I'm not sure. But I think that the exams have driven out intercultural knowledge, because that was not, the mechanical language teaching that is accessible. So that's what I would do. To help in the thing, but I know that's not going to happen. Okay, but maybe again with another whoosh of the wand, you could have maybe different sorts of exams, or more like grades in music, where you're ready to, you could be assessed in how much you know culturally, or when you're ready, and therefore the pressure is different. But I know that's me.
So exams are exams are a bit of an issue. I have to say, when I first looked at the curriculum here, I was shocked that there was nothing about the culture and just the country itself. For instance, there's no requirements for students who learn French to know that France is a republic, that we have 2 chambers, that we have a president and a prime minister, that the president is elected every 5 years. There was no requirements to know that. And I was disappointed.
Until A level.
Until A level. But that's too late. That's too late because, we want the population to know these things. And not everybody does A levels in any way. And also, when you try to become a British citizen, you have to learn a book of cultural knowledge. And I was thinking, why don't we do something not as hard and dry, obviously, because it's for children, but just something about what it is to go to France. What does France look like? Something about the territories, like Guadeloupe, Martinique. Most of our students happen to discover that if the teacher mentions it, but they're not going to be required to know that. And I find that really short-sighted. So if you could have an impact definitely on the exams content, that'd be great. Now, you did say no exams, and now my teacher head is panicking because this is sometimes the only thing that motivates some of the students.
Yes, it was in jest, but yes, it's just hopefully things are going to go the right way with, as for people like us, you and me and many others, on, the emphasis on culture. So let's wait and see.
Okay. But so far, the emphasis on culture only depends on teachers who are passionate about it.
Yes.
And I'm sure there is a lot, because teachers chose to learn French and to teach it because they liked it. So they're likely to talk about the culture that goes with it, and the food. Let's not forget the food. I always do lessons about French food, and the kids like it because it's got some weird ingredients like the snails and the oysters, and also it's fun, and they will remember that. And when you talk about snails, another thing to talk about the Francosphere, you can mention that in some French-speaking countries, they eat snails that are huge, as big as my hand. So the children always love to talk about it. But let's go back to your vision. So you said that you would change the exam content at least so that it includes a little bit more about culture. And what about just the content of the curriculum? Is there anything you would want all students who do 2 or 3 years of French language to know after these 2 or 3 years of learning?
In terms of culture, or
in any term, whether it's decolonizing or French as a language, whatever you think is essential for a British student to know after studying French in school?
I think in terms of language, it almost doesn't matter what the topics could be quite flexible. In terms of, as you said, you said yourself, there are a few things that could be helpful to know about France, and that's again in the IB program. That's much more. There's a greater emphasis on comparing countries. And I think we don't do that enough in the UK curriculum. So they learn how to compare their daily life or whatever, topic. And that's a must. They must do that. And they must do that at the exam. And that's from the scratch. I mean, they, the course book I wrote, Panorama Francophone, was for the ab initio. So we're talking beginners, older beginners, 15, 16-year-olds, but they don't have any language. But from day one, that is part of the deal that they have that. And that's what I would like to see more of, to have that time for reflection on similarities and differences, and obviously on accepting the differences and not mocking them, and being much more aware of what it is to be in somebody else's skin.
Yes, I think practicing tolerance is a good can do in learning a language.
And I think we can still do that, but as you say, in this country, but I think, as you say, it needs to be from the teacher who happens to be quite into that. Whereas as I said, in the IB, you have to. There's no question. It is assessed.
Yeah.
No, and I was going to say that that's one of what I would hope to be able to do is to help teachers include that in, more as a matter of fact, really, and by providing them with something that, they could do easily. It doesn't need to be a lot of things, but I think it's quite scary to, if you're told decolonize your curriculum, I think that's quite scary.
It's a big word.
It's a big word. It's a big thing to do. And I lack confidence sometimes to, you need to learn as I said before, to educate yourself a little bit more, to know where you're going, to know what you're saying, to know, like in France, I've discovered things very recently by, it's like peeling the skin, of the onions,
Yes.
it's the peeling literally things off my eyes. I mean, and that's from somebody, as I said, I was quite sensitive to those issues, but I didn't know so much about French history and French colonial history, that I was, it scared me that how much is kept from us.
Yeah, it's. I was flabbergasted when I was looking into the origins of the funding of the Eiffel Tower, for instance, and I wrote a piece about it. There's so much in the colonial history that is kept under wrap, because if you address it, then you have to change the present, and that's a big fear that a lot of people have. You do talk about the daunting task. When we meet, and we meet at conferences, we've seen teachers coming to us and saying, I don't know how to start decolonizing, even though I really want to, because I feel like I'm going to say the wrong thing. And also people saying that they feel guilty. What do you have to say about this feeling of white guilt? What are your impressions on this?
Well, as I said, I think if it's difficult as a white person in particular, I think, to find your voice in this, because you don't want to come across as, I'm aware now, I want to decolonize, I have the answers, and this is how we're going to do it. Mm-hmm. At the same time, if the weight of the whole colonial history is on your shoulders, you're not going to be able to move. And it's finding that in between place and finding your voice. Now, when I went to Westminster Uni the other day, I met two Canadian academics called AJ Parasram and Alex Kashnabish, I think. I'm not sure how you pronounce their names. Anyway, they've written a book called Frequently Asked White Questions. And their talk was, because they're in Canada, obviously the racial issues, with... and they had meetings where white people came and asked questions about race, and it developed into a book. And so they've written this book called Frequently Asked White Questions. And they were saying that, they basically to sort of relax into it, and make mistakes. As long as you learn from them, they're good mistakes to learn, and start educating yourself by looking into what's available. And I did that, and I think we talked about it at the conference about looking at because of French being the language that I teach, of looking in Liliane Thuram's book, yes, called La Pensée Blanche, which is translated into English in White Thinking. And I learned such a lot from that book of things that I still didn't know. I had no idea, because I'd never heard that. Like about the bumidum, the yes, French, sort of the equivalent of the French Windrush. I never heard that. And so much like that. And he's also got a good website called Fondation Liliane Thuram, and loads of information there. Fondation pour la mémoire de l'esclavage, anything about, the memory of slavery. Again, a lot of resources there that are really interesting, and maybe not straight away usable for primary, obviously, but just for your own, just to see the extent of what we don't know really. And
it's a very important book. You're right to quote it, Liliane Thuram, La Pensée Blanche, White Thinking.
Yeah, and I learned a lot from a 3-part documentary, which I saw on TV, called Blood and Tears, The French Decolonization. It's sort of quite, it punches, and if you can get to see that, I think you learn such a lot. And basically, once you know a little bit more, then you feel more comfortable talking about them as well, about these issues.
I think you're right. It has to go through being self-taught, educating oneself, making sure we've done our research before we start talking about something, but also having enough empathy to recognize when we don't know and saying, oh, I don't know, I'm going to look into it, instead of having an
exactly
answer. Yeah.
Because as I said, it's not, I don't feel guilty about not knowing about those things, because I was never taught them.
Yes.
And work, unless you're an academic, looking into that, researching into that, it's never appeared on mainstream media. I'm thinking, for instance, about the BUMIDOM, the Bureau de Migration and all that. Basically when, the same as Windrush here, but I had no idea. And none of my educated, inverted commas, friends had ever heard of that either. Even people that are very politically engaged and aware. So there's no shame in not knowing. I think as long as you're interested in finding out, as you said, and that is enough.
Yes,
to start the
curiosity.
journey.
Yeah, that curiosity to want to understand the past, because otherwise we don't have a grasp of the present, and then we can't change anything. It really is. It starts by having a historical knowledge. I'm passionate about history, and I think you are as well. And this is the only way we can change by knowing what happened before. I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to ask you my last question. So, if you want to decolonize the curriculum and you're a teacher, what would you advise them to start with?
I think representation. So, just making sure that, it's not just white, French, middle class, as resources where, I'm talking about resources because that's my area of expertise, but, monsieur and madame and their 2.5 children living on in a pavilion outside Paris, that is not the world. We live in a connected world. We cannot not do, not represent it. And so that representation, I think, is the first step. If you're talking about food, there's, millions of things you can look up on the net about, what the main dishes are in Senegal or whatever. Also, depending on how the sort of children you're teaching, because in a mixed, like London, in a mixed ethnic group, they'll have their own experience. If you're not in a mixed class, it's even more important, I think, to represent, the Francosphere, because those children might not have that experience and that diversity. And then make it, I think, from, I think photos and visual material are powerful. I know that from experience, as I said about my dad's photos from Algeria. They can stay with you. So I think, again, rather than maybe the sort of bland textbook photo that you tend to see, look for other photos. With the net now, it's just incredibly easy. If you have a school, it could be a school somewhere else. All this is what Susie and myself will try and do in Francosphere, but yeah, it's just taking a little bit of time. So there's representation and making it a regular thing, so that it's not just the odd thing that you do once in a while. I think it needs to be regular.
Yes, and I always say it shouldn't be Black History Month once.
I hate that. No, it's
each month.
Yes. And it just can be light touch, really,
yes,
at the beginning. It doesn't have to be all this, pressure on your shoulders of doing all this well. And also, if you can have links with other schools that are in those countries, there are places you can go for that. I think that's the best, really, to put children in touch with each other with, even Zoom links or
any other.
And any other means of, and not just France. I know France is nearer, but for some schools, it's quite far. France is like not something that's accessible. So you might as well, travel further afield online as it's now available.
Yeah, I have to say the internet is a teacher's friend. It's so much easier to teach languages with the internet now.
And as language teachers, I think we are well placed to be border crossers, and that's one of our responsibilities, is to make sure that we cross those borders and that we show a different world to them and to the children. And the more regular it is, the more normal it becomes, and hopefully the more addictive it will be for the learners.
I love that image. I always thought myself as an ambassador presenting my culture, but I like that idea you have of being people who enable the opening of borders, because it's very contemporary. There's more and more borders and strict borders, and refugees are stopped or they're left to fend for themselves in the sea. So the idea of being the one who lets people cross from one side of the river to the next, or one side of the ocean to the next, is again very poetic and very apt to show how important our job is. We're not just teaching grammar, we're teaching empathy as well. So
yes, and I think we really are well placed to do that when we can, and that, I mean, I've always liked. I'm a bit of a nosy Parker. I've always liked like peeping through other people's houses, the windows, and seeing what is their front room like, and what is and
what
that's
do they eat?
what are they eating? And I think that's quite nice to be able to do that in class. Look at what the bedroom of these children in some Africa or whatever,
in Papua New Guinea or some other places. Yeah,
it's as long as we make sure that we're not carrying stereotypes, that we are
respectful.
That's another thing that often it's we have shown Africa, for instance, as poor and everything, and it's just negative. Whereas there are beautiful things too, but we need to show that as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Danielle, for this interview. It was wonderful.
Thank you very much for having me on.
It's time for a fresh start to language learning. Pearson Edexcel's new student-centred French, German and Spanish 2024 GCSEs cater to the needs of all learners, regardless of their background, ability or reason for studying. Rooted in learned language knowledge, their assessments are transparent and accessible, allowing all students to showcase their language skills. Through inclusive and relatable content, the new Pearson Edexcel MFL GCSEs build a shared cultural capital that helps students develop an understanding of and appreciation for the wider world. Find out more at go.pearson.com/MFL GCSE 24.
This programme has been brought to you by the Happy Confident Company. Our clinically approved, ready-to-go wellbeing and mental health programme will help your pupils thrive. In only 10 minutes a day, you'll be able to deliver social and emotional learning and wellbeing tools throughout your school. To find out more, visit us at www.happyconfident.com.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.